Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I'm Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am, of course, here not speaking for my employer because I never speak for my employer. I'm also not here with Chris Carlson, which is sort of surprising because Chris is supposed to be in the show tonight. I have sent him a note saying, hey, Chris, we got a show. And so hopefully he'll be popping in any second now. But, worst case scenario is it'll be a quick show because actually the slides that I've got for tonight are almost all Chris. But let me go ahead and start talking about a few things, and then we'll go ahead and hopefully Chris will show up. But hope everybody's doing well. And let me go ahead and pull my slides up and do that. Okay, so like I said, it's supposed to be Chris and I, just me so far. Hopefully Chris will show up. Here's the schedule for the next little bit of time, the somewhat Chris-centric schedule. So next week, I will be at Traveler Con, which is a traveler science fiction convention, traveler-oriented gaming convention in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'll be hanging out with Chuck Gannon there. He invited me to come to this thing, and I'm going to talk to the people who run it about maybe doing some presentations next year. Hopefully it'll be an opportunity to talk with some traveler people, because as you can see on the next 3 to 4 weeks thing, I want to talk about navies and traveler, and that I expect that's going to be a couple of episodes. It's probably going to be at least one episode per book, and I'm currently planning on reading Sector Fleet, Imperial Navy, Fifth Frontier War, and I want to say that there's another book that sort of covers some of that background stuff too. And so that's the plan. I just finished reading This is Free Trader Beowulf, which is the history of the Traveler game, 300 pages of history of the Traveler game, and learned a lot of stuff. I knew a bunch of behind the scenes stuff, but I learned a bunch of stuff that I, put stuff in perspective, and a few things I didn't fully appreciate that I now have a much better understanding of. The 19th is a yes, and then the 26th and the 2nd of October are no's, because I'm going to be traveling during that time period. I'm going to be out of town and not available. And then on the 9th of November, I'm going to be out of town on the 9th of November also, but that I'll be in Des Moines for that. And so my expectation is on the 9th of November, I'll do a show, maybe from my brother's place, or at least my brother might be part of it, I guess. And then the 16th of November is a yes. And then the 30th of November is the weekend after Thanksgiving. And I don't know what my Thanksgiving plans are. Depending upon how things work out with a few things, I may be home here, in which case I'll do a show, or I may actually be on the road at that point. Although chances are I'll probably be back by then regardless. I just need to figure out what my schedule is going to look like and whether I'm going to have time to do a show. So that's the plan on that. Right now, I can't really go any further until Chris shows up, but let's talk a little bit about what we've talked about with LCS so far. Yeah, make me big. Thank you very much, Lissa. So this is the last part in a long session about LCS. And so I spent some time talking about small ships and small combatants. And then we talked about specifically LCS and how it fits into things, and the justification for LCS and whether it was a good test. You may recall, talked about Bob Work's 2004 paper. Bob Work made the proposal, said, hey, they're talking about doing this LCS thing. Here's how small ships have been used in the past, and here's how LCS could be. And so you've got a couple of different criteria that you can use to look at with regard to LCS. One of them is the Littoral Combat Ship. One of them is, okay, did the argument that was made make sense? And part of it was, did they actually do the thing that they said would be a good thing to do, potentially be a good thing to do? And how did that turn out? And so Bob Work specifically said, hey, we should conduct this experiment. Here's some of the thinking behind doing this. We should actually conduct the experiment and see how it worked. And The program itself had a bunch of issues, and that's led to some of the problems with it. I think they've got a lot of the stuff fixed, but there was how they sold it had some issues, and there were some other issues associated with it as well. I think that there is some interesting capability there, but when push comes to shove, I guess my personal assessment is, if we had it to do over again, you end up paying about $700 million, $800 million, something like that, which is a good chunk towards the total cost of a Burke, an early Burke class ship. And you get about a tenth of the capability of a Burke. So you pay about, 60, 70% of the cost of a Burke, and you get a tenth of the capability. I'm not sure the Navy can afford that trade-off. That having been said, one of the things that they talk about in the defense acquisition business, any acquisition business, is the sunk cost fallacy, right? You shouldn't throw good money after bad because you've already spent the money. You're not going to get it back. But, maybe I wouldn't buy these things if I had it to do over again, but I've bought them. What can I do with them? Now, when Chris shows up, that's going to be part of the conversation that we're going to have with that, is what you can do with them. But part of it, one of the ideas that I said was, especially the LCS2 class, the Independent, has a huge flight deck, and it has a good size hangar, and so maybe it can make up for some of the helicopter landing pads we're losing with the Ticonderogas leaving the fleet. So I did a quick little bit of research, and because that was just an idea that occurred to me. I hadn't actually looked at any of the numbers, and as it turns out, that probably isn't something to really sort of seriously consider. Or let me rephrase that. The need is not as great as I thought it might be. And the reason why I say that is, of the Arleigh Burke class ships, so the issue was with the Flight 1 and Flight 2 Arleigh Burkes, they did not have a helicopter hangar. And so we were replacing ships that had helicopter hangars with ships that didn't have helicopter hangars. And then we were going to get rid of some more ships that had helicopter hangars. So we built a total of 27 Ticonderoga class cruisers, and they're trying to get rid of all of them by 2027. But we've got on order like 88, something like that, 90, maybe it's 94. I think it might be 94 Arleigh Burke class ships. We're building a metric ship ton. The first 20 some, whole numbers between 51 and 78, did not have a hangar. So the first 26 didn't have hangars, but the other two-thirds plus of them do have helicopter hangars. And we've put more hangars into the fleet than we've taken away. More they all have landing pads. This is about helicopter hangars. We're putting more helicopter hangars into the fleet than we're taking away. I forgot to go and check the Spruances, because the Spruances sort of left the force a while ago and they had helicopter hangars. But, now we're talking about something that the Spruances left the force like 20 years ago, or close to 20 years ago. So presumably the Navy sort of got its act together in terms of sort of figuring out how to optimize things. And in addition to that, on top of that, capabilities change over time. Helicopters have become more capable. The threat has changed. So there's no reason to think that the US Navy is doing things the same way that it did 20 years ago. We know that helicopters are important, but there's a danger of doing an apples and oranges comparison. And on top of that, a very, very simple apples and oranges comparison. So with that in mind, I really kind of wonder if it, I don't think we lost a whole lot by not going down that path. Okay, so I've been talking about LCS for a while now, and I haven't talked about anything related to science fiction. So let's do a little bit of science fiction talk about LCS real quick. So we went through a bunch of the different issues that you have with a small ship, and so one of them is just sea keeping and speed, maintaining speed, keeping with the battle group, etc., in a situation where you've got to deal with weather. And the thing is, when seas get rough, ships get slower. It's harder and harder for a ship to sort of force its way through the waves. And the bigger the ship, the easier it is, and the smaller the ship, the harder it is. And LCS is a relatively small ship. It's about 3,000 tons, and they always knew that it was going to have some issues with fueling. And so that was one of the things they kept talking about. Chris specifically made the comment that fuel is fuel, right? You can't compress fuel. You can't miniaturize fuel. Fuel is fuel. And but my comment was, okay, so if it's got shorter legs, it still has the full up capabilities. You just need to fuel it more often. And so there isn't really an equivalent weather thing with regard to any sort of space situation. But you could easily envision other things about science fiction, other science fiction universes involving spacecraft, where you could come up with something that might be something similar to that. Like maybe it's not weather per se, but it's the equivalent of whether you can fit a jump drive in it, right? You end up with some universes where not every ship has an FTL drive. I really, really like Frank Chadwick's 2-volume series, and I can't remember the name of the main character, but in those ships, the destroyer class ships are actually battle riders. They are carried by the cruisers. The cruisers have an FTL drive. The destroyers do not have an FTL drive, and as a result, the destroyers are somewhat limited in what they can do, but that works out okay for it. And so you can sort of view that as being the same sort of constraint that an LCS sized ship might have, and one of the different trade-offs there. So you don't have weather, but you do have other things that might impact your ability to stay with the fleet. Now, I see that Tom Pope has asked a question. Let's take a look at what he has to say here. Okay, so Tom asked the question about, could you refit a Flight 1, or implied in that is a Flight 2, to a Flight 2A? Now, the numbering scheme on the Burks is really kind of weird. And it's weird in the following way. Flight 1s and Flight 2s are almost identical. There used to be a time period, I don't know if that's still the case, there used to be a time period where you could look at it from the outside, and based upon the angle of one antenna, you could tell whether you were looking at a Flight 1 or a Flight 2, if you had the right angle on it, that you could see whether it was straight up or whether it was canted backwards. I don't know if that antenna is even still there, so I don't know if that still works or not. The flight between Flight 2 and Flight 2A, though, you had a dramatic change in the ship, and they added a hangar, they moved the radars, they enclosed an area of the bridge. There's all sorts of major changes. So why did they call that a 2A? Why didn't they call that a Flight 3? Well, the answer was there was a Flight 3 proposal, and they decided it was too expensive. So Flight 2A was really a Flight 3 minus. And so they called it a 2A, thus leading to a situation where 1 and 2 are identical, and 2 and 2A are dramatically different. And then now, since then, they've come up with a Flight 3, an honest to goodness Flight 3, which is not the same Flight 3 that they proposed earlier, because it's 20 years later and they changed the design again. So could you refit a Flight 1 to a Flight 2A? And I think the answer is almost certainly no. They made a lot of internal changes, and if you look, you can see that they moved the radars. The radars are big and heavy, and they moved the radars in order to be able to get a view over the helicopter hangar that they added. So it might be possible to do, I don't know, a Flight 1A with some sort of hangar capability. But the thing about that hangar is that hangar has gear in it. It's not just that it's not a tent. I think there might even be a crane in there. If I were designing it, I'd certainly put a crane in there to be able to do an engine swap or something like that if I needed to. And so it's a big lift to do that. In other places, there's some of the things like you have to install a RAST gear. RAST is the system that you use to land helicopters in bad weather. The idea is the helicopter um, drops a line down, grabs a cable, brings it up to the ship, brings it up to the helicopter. And now what the pilot does, the pilot sort of keeps the line tense. He's trying to gain altitude, but he's tethered to the ship, so he can't. And the ship winches him to the deck. So why does that work? The reason why that works is because it means that you never have to worry about a wave causing the ship to come up and slap the bottom of the helicopter, because they're tethered together and the pilot's always trying to go up and the ship winches them down. And so when they get down to the deck, they're now attached to the ship and the pilot can stop trying to winch them up, and they'll come and they'll chain the helicopter down, or move it around or do whatever they need to do. So that's how that works. So there's a lot of structural changes in between the Flight 2 and the Flight 2A that I don't think that you could just go and do it in a way that would be even remotely economical. It's sort of funny how these refits work. When the USS Belknap collided with the John F. Kennedy, she basically burned her entire superstructure away. She collided with the carrier. The carrier dumped tens of thousands of gallons of kerosene down her stack. There was a huge fire. The superstructure was aluminum and all melted away. Belknap was due to go into the yard for a reasonably major refit. And so she was already scheduled for the yard. And so now this is a different problem, right? They have to do all the recovery stuff. They have to cut away all the stuff and do a damage assessment. And then they have to come up with a plan to rebuild that ship. She ended up, as a result of burning her entire superstructure away, she actually ended up with a refit that was cheaper and more comprehensive than the refit that she was originally scheduled to get. Now, so why not just set all your ships on fire and do it that way? Well, the answer was it was a refit that took like 5, 6, 7 years, because first they had to clear out all the damage and do a damage assessment, and then they had to come up with a new plan, and then they had to build a new superstructure. So the end result was a ship that ended up being way more capable than they were going to make it, but it took a lot longer to do it. So in this particular case, there's probably other stuff buried in there. I don't have a whole lot of time on flight. I've never been to sea on a Flight 2A. The only time I've been aboard a Flight 2A twice. I transited Oscar Austin because when I came back on USS Porter to Norfolk, we moored outboard of Oscar Austin, and I had to walk across her deck to get ashore. And then, as Tom remembers, for I think it was the very first BuNine annual meeting, which we were still calling HonorCon back at the time, Tom and I got a chance to do a tour with David Weber. So hold on just a second. Okay. I just got a note from Chris. Chris is not going to make it tonight. He totally spaced it. Completely forgot about the podcast. We had to run out and take Katie's mom to church and then dinner afterwards. I am so sorry. Okay, so that happens. That's fine. He's busy doing family stuff, and that's perfectly okay. So I just said we'll reschedule, and so we'll reschedule this. So this will probably, if Chris is going to be available on the 19th of October, we'll end up doing guess we're going to do LCS Part 4. So if anybody's got any questions, you should ask questions, because we've got some time. So in any event, Tom and I and the rest of BuNine, which included David Weber, went to Norfolk, and we got a tour, first of all, Los Angeles class submarine, and then we got a tour of an Arleigh Burke Flight 2A. I got it written down somewhere, but I don't remember which ship it was. And we got to see a large chunk of that ship, including going into the magazine for the 5-inch gun. And I'd never gone down in the magazine before, but it's a ladder. And usually on a ship, when you say ladder, frequently on a ship, when you say ladder, what you mean is really steep stairs. This was a ladder. And I got to climb all the way down, back down to where all the magazine stuff is stored. And it looks an awful lot like, a little bit cleaner, a little bit better painted, a little bit more modern, but it looks an awful lot like the 5-inch magazines that you see if you go to see the Massachusetts in Fall River, Massachusetts, USS Massachusetts. And that's a good ship to go to because you can go and see the 5-inch magazines. That's probably my favorite museum ship because it's the ship that I know of that has the most amount of stuff that's open. I need to go see Alabama again and get a better idea on Alabama. Tom says it was DDG 98. Tom, do you want to look up what the name of that ship is? So we'll do a shout out to those guys. Thank you, Tom. Forrest Sherman. Oh, okay. So that's a name to conjure with. There was a Forrest Sherman. I think there was a sprue can named Forrest Sherman. There was a Forrest Sherman class destroyer that was a late World War, maybe early post-war, I think. So Forrest Sherman, to be honest, I don't remember the story of him other than he was a U.S. naval officer. Ask me about Stephen Decatur or some of the others, and I can tell you an awful lot. But I don't remember him. We need to have a Willis Lee. We really need to have a ship named after Willis Lee. So I don't know that there's ever been one named after him, and there needs to be. Okay, so anybody else have any questions real quick? So let's see. What else can I say about LCS and transferring into space terms? I mean, I made the comment that LCS to me looks a lot like the Danish Absalon class ship, which spent some time talking about, 100 episodes or so ago. The Absalon has about the armament of a frigate. In fact, I think they call some of the follow-ons that are based on the same hull actual frigates, or maybe they call it a destroyer. I can't remember. It doesn't have a very heavy armament, but what it does have is a big mission bay. They weren't putting all their money on the LCS type modules. They use Standflex, which are basically bolt-on weapon systems up on the deck, but their purpose of having a big mission bay was the idea that you could use it to do humanitarian relief. You could use it to move a small number of military forces around. Like you need to send a platoon someplace and all their vehicles, it would be a good little transport to do stuff like that. And I think I said last time or the time before when we were talking about LCS that when I saw that thing, it really reminds me, and LCS 2 also, the Independence class, reminds me a lot of the Corvette transports that you see in Starship Troopers, right? There's this talk about how the mobile infantry would prefer these Corvette transports that carry a platoon around. They're good for raids. Whereas the Navy looks at it and says, I'd rather have this really big ship because a Corvette transport requires about the same amount of crew as a big ship, but it's only moving around, a platoon. I'd rather be able to carry a regiment around with me or a company or at least a battalion. I'd like to be able to carry a battalion size transport. I don't need as many crew that way. Whereas I think it really, when I see something like that, that's what it really sort of reminds me of, is the ability to move small amount of forces around. And that sort of ties into some of the missions that Bob Work talked about in LCS. There was this big deal made about how it wasn't survivable as it was in a high intensity conflict situation. Well, yeah. Small ships aren't survivable in high intensity conflict situations. That's frequently the case. And that's one of the reasons why we don't build as many small ships as we used to, because we always sort of expected a high intensity conflict situation. But if you've read Corbett, I talked about this also probably 60 episodes ago. If you've read Corbett, and he talks about the battle force and he talks about the flotilla, And the flotilla are the ships that sort of go and do the workaday stuff of putting in mines and taking out mines and doing patrols and, doing the sort of policing stuff that you do in a combat situation, but they're not intended to be part of a big fleet action. And that's really what LCS was intended to do. I mean, they talked about it as a minesweeper. They talked about it as a mine layer. They talked about it doing that kind of job. And that kind of job is not the sort of thing that you would want to do in a big fleet action. And so in Star Trek terms, by the time that, next gen rolls around, you still see Mirandas around, right? There's all sorts of Mirandas around. Do you think they're sending the Mirandas to go do the high intensity missions? No, they're not. And that's fine because that's perfectly fine in that situation because there's a lot of missions that aren't high intensity missions. And that if you need it to sort of go under the guns of the enemy, you bring in some backup to go with it. And so the fact that it only had self-defense capability was not that big a deal, because if it needs more than that, that's not the ship that you want to be sending in. Now, there's a place where that logic falls apart, because Work talked about the 10 traditional missions of small ships, and that included things like mine laying and mine hunting and stuff like that. But you've got this other mission, which is unique to the 21st century that he talked about, and that was the idea of laying out battle force sensors, right? You're putting sensors out to do stuff. Now, to the best of my knowledge, we really haven't developed anything like that. Maybe you could say USVs, UUVs that you can send. Unmanned vehicles can go function as sensors, but it's not like, there's a Mark 37 sensor buoy that we now need to be able to deploy, or a bottom sensor or something like that. We talk about doing that stuff, but we haven't done it yet. But I could easily see that being something that you would see happening in Star Trek. I could easily see Miranda sort of on the edge of if they had to defend a system, on the edge of the system, deploying sensor buoys or something like that, deploying mines, something like that. Better to use a ship like that may still have some life in her, but otherwise is probably kind of obsolete, or at least obsolescent. Better to use something like that than it is to tie down a battle force asset doing sort of trivial stuff that's important. I don't want to make it sound like it's not important, but not the sort of thing that you need $1 billion worth of capability to do. And, talking about $1 billion worth of capability, that's where we get back to the problem of LCS. I think when push comes to shove, the real problem with LCS is that even with serial production, it's too expensive. It's not worth it for what we get. If that thing had been 300 million instead of 700 million or 750 or whatever it ended up, if it had been 300 million, might be worth it. Might be worth doing something like that. As it is in the real world, I don't think it is. Scott Voigt mentions the Apollo platforms. So that's specifically a reference to Honor Harrington. The Apollo system was the idea that you would have pod knots would launch a pod of missiles. And when they launched a pod of missiles, they would, one of the missiles would have an FTL transmitter instead of a warhead, and it would be able to talk back to the mainframe on the main ship. And so, and the ship is compiling all the sensor information that it has from its own ship sensors. It's compiling all the information that it's getting from all the missiles that are being sent out. It's processing that stuff on the big ass computer that it's got back home, and then it's sending commands out to the ship. And those commands are doing things like allowing it to penetrate ECM and allowing it to do target deconfliction, so that not everybody's shooting at the same thing, right? If you're firing my wall of battle at your wall of battle, let's coordinate that a little bit. And so that's potentially a very useful thing to be able to do. That's one of the reasons why I really like the Honorverse, is that David Weber actually has a technological progression that forces all the combatants to change tactics. gives them the opportunity to change tactics. And if you're dealing against it, you have to change tactics. It's not just like we invented a better jet. So, oh, our airplane got better, so we're going to do airplane stuff. We're just going to do it better. No, this was actually like rewriting the tactical manual. And so when things like that come up, that always warms my heart when I see stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons why I love reading the Honorverse. You know what? Let me pull those slides back up for just a second, because I know what the next slide is. And even though we're not going to go, we can go to the next slide. We're not going to go beyond it, but the next slide is an example of just what I was talking about, which is a pod super dreadnought from Honor Harrington. That is the Harrington class, if I remember correctly. And it dumps those pods out the back. You see that there's a cluster of 6 of them, and each of those pods have a bunch of missiles in them. Now, the missile pod on the right, I can't remember exactly where that comes from. That might just be something that Chris pulled off the web. The one on the left and the image up above, I believe, are both official BuNine drawings, which means they were either done, I believe the one up above was done by Tom Pope, and the one down, I'm sorry, by Thomas Maroney, who is a BuNine member. The one down below was done by, might have been done by Tom Pope, or it might have been done by Thomas. So let's see. And so that's sort of how that works. Now, you might be asking yourself, this is part of Chris's slide deck, and we're talking about LCS, and yet there's an illustration of an Honor Harrington Podnaut. Wonder what Chris is planning on talking about. We'll see. We'll see when Chris remembers to come to the show the next time. Let's bring me back up. So, okay. So Tom Pope says that the one on the top was Thomas Maroney, and that the one on the left was somebody named Russ Eisler, and that name doesn't sound familiar. I don't remember that name at all. And that the one on the right might have been one of John O'Donnell's renders. So John is also a member of BuNine, and he started modeling a bunch of this stuff beforehand. Last time I saw John, I also got to see his 3D printed Star Knight. It was 3 feet long. At least. Might have been longer than that. It was sitting in the middle of the dining room table, basically clobbering the entire dining room table. And
they say that size doesn't matter.
I'm reminded of the line from Wing Commander when the one character says to the guy that she was going to end up shagging in the next scene, something to the effect of, I'm sure she told you size doesn't matter. She lied. But in any event, that's a pretty good ship. Now, one of these days, I'm going to be able to show you some Traveler ships, because even as we speak, Brian Haven, another BuNine member, is printing off Traveler ships for me, and they're all about this big around, this big-ish, about a foot. So a Gazelle class close escort and a Fiery class Gund escort and some other things. Russ Isler did the internal illustrations for enemy hands. This was pre-BuNine. Okay. Podnauts? I thought BuNine was around before Podnauts. I thought we predated Podnauts. My total internal clock, my internal chronology on the Honorverse is all jacked up in that regard. And the reason why it's all jacked up is because when I first joined BuNine, I got pulled in because I could talk about navies. I could talk about science fiction and the real world at the same time, navies in both of those at the same time. It wasn't because I was an Honorverse expert by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, at that point, I hadn't read any of the Honorverse. And so I had bought it all. I bought the first book when it first came out in the store. And the way I always described it to people was, The thing about series, I hate when you read a book in a series and you want to read the next one and you can't. So I'll buy the books religiously and I'll wait for people to get a couple ahead before I start reading them. And next thing I know, David had 50 books out and a new one coming out every 6 weeks. And so I just hadn't gotten caught up yet. And so for a long time, I was way behind everybody else in the Honorverse. BuNine consisted of a bunch of really hardcore Honor Harrington fans and Chris, who knew he was eventually going to be a hardcore Honor Harrington fan, but wasn't yet at this point. Okay. Hello, Melissa. And so, I also enjoy Prelude to Axanar. Let me tell you one thing, though. I had nothing to do with Prelude to Axanar other than I was a Kickstarter supporter, just like everybody else was. And I ended up doing this show because one day Alec needed somebody to be on his show that he had on Saturday nights at 10 o'clock. So he invited me on the show and we talked about Warhammer 40K for 90 minutes. And then next thing I know, 3 weeks later, he's handed the keys to me and I'm doing a show called Starfleet Tactical. And he never even asked me. He just sort of, he assumed I would say yes. And of course I would say yes. So he didn't really need to ask me. So Alec sometimes watches the show when he's got an opportunity to, and he does stuff on the Aries Studio channel also. He'll do little updates every now and then. So, but yeah, Prelude is really pretty cool. And Tom Pope and I got to go down, and Wright Sublette was there also, and Scott Voigt was there also. And so we got to go see the current version, current as of 2 months ago now, 6 weeks ago, something like that. 2 months, I think. We got to see the current version of the Axanar, the full up Axanar cut with the new stuff. And at that point, the special effects weren't done. It was just the actors on stage, etc. And a lot of them I can't mention. Although, you know, I guess the only thing I ever say about that is I was really thrilled to hear "I'll be back" in a Star Trek movie. I'm totally lying about that. But it was a lot of fun, and we watched it on the main bridge viewer. On the bridge set, I was sitting in the captain's chair, and it was pretty good. And he showed us some rough special effects later. But there was things like, you know, they were doing things for a matte shot on the Klingon homeworld and how Karn's ancestral, I think it was Karn's ancestral house looked, and, you know, where's the Klingon Empire logo and what the windows are shaped like and stuff like that. So when I tried to call him not too long ago, he texted me back. It's like, I'm sitting here working with, I'm trying to remember who he was working with at the time, but he, you know, we're working on something. I'll call you later. And so, you know, they're hard at work trying to get that movie done. So knock on wood, unless we have COVID again or some other lawsuit or something like that, they should have it done sooner rather than later. Yeah, he was, Scott said Dana was doing his magic. So yeah, he was working with Dana on this. But Alec is doing great. He's doing great. Okay, so anybody have any questions you want me to talk about here? Somebody said, in fact, I think it was Scott, said something about any lacks. I don't have any lack illustrations there. I think I've shown lacks in some of the other slides. The thing that's interesting about a lacks sort of give you an idea of what the scale is in that universe. You know, the lacks come from a lack carrier, a sea lack. And it carries like 80 per side, if I remember correctly. Tom, do you remember off the top of your head? Let me know. I counted them up. I can't just remember off the top of my head. And each one of those lacks is not the length of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, but it's the mass of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. They've got a crew of what, 8, 10, something like that. But they're the size, you know, they're shorter. They're like 400 feet, if I remember correctly. And they're just they're huge. We would consider that a major warship. For them, it's, you know, ship's boat sort of deal. Crew of 10. So it's like 60 per side is what Tom said. So yeah, that sounds right. I counted up the number of doors and got a number. So it's like 60 per side. So yeah, these ships are huge. They're absolutely ginormous. So let's see, what else do we have here? I'm looking up here. Okay. Peter Gold points out Forrest Sherman was CNO starting in 1949, oversaw start of the Korean War and issues with the USN. Yeah, so I guess the Forrest Sherman class destroyer was later than that. Must have been later than that. Let's see. Okay, I'm scrolling up. I'm not seeing anything in terms of new questions. So Melissa says, is it Federation or, and are you talking about the LAC carrier? Because if you're talking about the LAC carrier, that's from the Honor Harrington universe. So one of the dangers on this universe, on this show, is that we mix and match universes all the time. I'm especially bad about it. I was going back and re-listening to all the episodes I did with Chris in preparation for this one, and I'm reminded for the 400th time, and it's especially the case that when Chris gets on, Chris and I will end up in a conversation, and there are times where I should be saying things to like, oh, let me explain the context of the statement I just made. I'm not always as good about that as I should be. So that having been the case, please feel free. Everybody should feel free to throw a rock. If I do something where it's like, hey, can you explain what you meant by that? Because we didn't spend 20 years working for the Navy. It's like, okay, I'm happy to do that. In fact, that's what I want to do. I'm just not always as good as I could be. Logic's Finest asks a question: is there a definitive answer on directed energy weapons on the Ford class carriers? My niece serves on the USS Gerald Ford. I haven't heard anything that looks like a definitive answer. I will say that, not speaking for my employer, I will say that, you know, one of the things about aircraft carriers is they build these things to be around for a long time, right? The Nimitz herself was commissioned in 1968, so she's been around for like 50 years. I think it was 68, something like that. So they've been around for a long, long time. And the plan is for them to be around for a long, long time. And they built the Ford class with the assumption that they were going to need extra electrical power to do things like lasers or some other form of directed energy. So the Navy is planning on being able to do something like that. I would argue that Navy ships are particularly good as a platform for directed energy. So if you look at it, something like a tank or a Jeep or something like that is too small to have the right power requirements. Just lasers you need a lot of energy. Airplanes are better, but still not great. Army stuff like fixed installations are fine in terms of like, you know, I can have a big generator attached to my laser, but I probably need a bunch of them around the periphery. Same is true of air bases. I probably need to have a bunch of them around. So it's the thing that a ship gets you that those other things don't is the possibility of a big generator, a big power generation capability that you can put on this thing. Coupled with the fact that it's a point defense thing, right? So the missiles coming to you, I don't have to worry about spreading them around the periphery of the airbase. I know the missile's coming to me. If the missile isn't coming to me, I don't have to shoot at it anyway. So from that standpoint, ships seem to me to be the natural place to put something like directed energy to do point defense. So that having been said, I am not a directed energy directed energy expert. One could make the argument I know more about lasers in the Honorverse than I do lasers in the real world. I know a fair amount about lasers in the real world for somebody who's not a physicist or an engineer, but that having been said. Okay. So no definitive answer, but that's the answer. Scott Voigt points out that the Honorverse has some great audiobooks. Yes, they are fantastic. The narrators are fantastic through Audible. The one narrator does say Manticorin rather than Manticorin. It's not her fault. David Weber would be the first person to tell you it's not her fault. David sent her the wrong pronunciation. He meant to say it's not Manticorin, it's this. Instead, he said it's Manticorin. So that's the issue. So Scott points out they've only had a laser one deployed on a DDG right now. I don't know if they actually even still have that deployed. That was a test case, and I don't even know if they have one currently deployed. Logic's Finest asks, is the Nimitz still scheduled to be decommissioned in 2025? I don't know what the current status of that is. I think so. I know that ship is been rode hard and well, I can't even say that it's really been rode hard and put away wet, but they have had some turbine issues. I think that's one of the ships they had a turbine issue with. It was either that or Carl Vinson. I can't remember. The other thing about those ships is that over time, I've talked about this in the show too. Over time, they put more and more test gear on the Nimitzes, and it's basically clobbered about a third of the hangar bay. So on the Fords, they've moved that test gear out of the hangar bay. Now they had a place there's places you could put that on the Nimitz, but the problem is that it's test gear for things like engines. So you need to be able to get an aircraft engine to the test gear. And so they can move the test gear, but they couldn't create the proper line of approach to get an engine to it. So they built the new ship with the assumption that they're going to be moving engines to test gears. And so the Gerald R. Ford class is designed that way. So even though the hangar bay isn't any bigger, in effect, it's 50% bigger because they don't have a third of it clobbered with all this test gear. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that the electromagnetic catapult gives them some capabilities they don't currently have. It allows you to dial down in very fine gradations the amount of acceleration that you're putting on the thing that you're launching, which has two effects. One, it means it puts less stress on airplanes because a catapult shot is a big jerk, and then it sort of tapers off as it finishes. So it allows you to sort of accelerate slowly and evenly, puts less stress on your airplanes so your airplanes last longer. And it also means you're not going to rip the nose wheel off of something that's much smaller than an airplane, like a UAV. And so that's part of the reason why they did that, is to make UAVs work better. Now, I'll note, this is not the sort of problem that you really quite run into in science fiction. First of all, who uses steam catapults in space? Everything we've seen seems to indicate that they use some sort of electromagnetics. Although, you may recall in the original Battlestar Galactica, in the original opening episode, there's a scene where Starbuck is in the launch tube being friendly with Cassiopeia, and Athena sees this going on and hits a button marked steam purge. And you see him like jump up because he's being scalded by steam. So why do they have steam there? I don't understand why they have steam there. Doesn't make any sense to me. But I can easily see a situation where you have something like an electromagnetic catapult to launch both small craft and to launch probes or whatever. And depending upon what it is, maybe it's launching missiles, maybe it's launching railgun rounds. The difference between your railgun and your fighter launch tube may simply be how high you've got the acceleration cranked up. And so at some point, there's the old episode I did about aircraft carriers in space, sort of the follow-on to that, which includes this idea that maybe you the entire battle is taking place by a ship that's moving along at a pretty good clip, and what looks like a simple out and back is really everybody's moving sideways at a really tremendous velocity. When you change the frame of reference, you see that that's taking place. In that world, it makes sense that you'd have an electromagnetic catapult that would help out in that case. That would give you a little bit extra capability, a little bit extra delta V in the tanks from the fighter than if you just had to use fuel to do the entire thing. Okay, so Melissa was asking and got an answer here about the Ares, whether it's a Constitution class or not. No, it's much earlier than that. This is taking place. So the Prelude to Axanar is the story of Garth of Izar, which if you go back and you watch the original series, he's the character that had gone insane and was on the insane asylum planet. And he had been a great hero of Kirk's, but he had eventually gone insane. And so basically, this is something that occurred before Kirk joined Starfleet. So that's the time period we're talking about, before the Constitution class is out. So it's basically seems to be the last major class before the Constitution class, at least in the Prelude to Axanar background. It's not entirely clear. It seems to have been a warship design, whereas the Constitution class is really an explorer. But now, of course, we're getting into the fact that this is a different continuity than you've got in the main series continuity, and realistically, there's about 12 continuities in the main series. They're not even continuous with themselves, let alone with each other. So my voice is holding out better than I thought I was going to. I actually stayed home sick yesterday, and at some point earlier today considered just canceling the show because I wasn't sure if I was going to have a voice by the time this rolled around. But as it turns out, I have a voice. So let me go through and look at other questions. Logic's Finest says launching in space shouldn't need catapults, just take off and accelerate when clear of the ship. Yes, that's certainly a possibility. The thing is, like, you could theoretically do that on an aircraft carrier too. In fact, the original aircraft carriers did it that way. The thing about using a catapult is it allows you to get some extra speed. So you've got the speed of the ship represented on a regular aircraft carrier in terms of wind over the deck. You've got the speed of the ship, and then you've got the speed of the catapult, and that means that your engines have to do less work. And so the net effect of that is that it means that you can take off with a larger load. Now, the important thing that he's hinting at here is that in the real world, you're worried about that airplane flying, right? If it doesn't have enough airspeed, it doesn't take off when it's been catapulted. It falls into the ocean and everybody dies. So that's an issue that you don't want to have happen, and you don't really have the space equivalent of that. But what you might have in space is the idea that you've got a limited amount of delta V in your tanks, and any delta V you can use from the launching ship directly translates into fuel that you don't have to spend to get to the target. And it's extra fuel to get home. So it might mean that you can hit a target that's farther out. It might mean that you can hit that you can spend more time on station before you have to come back. It also, at least in theory, means that if you're under attack at the time, you can spit fighters out and they're harder to hit. In fact, that's what I think is really going on in Battlestar Galactica. In fact, in a previous episode, I offered the hypothesis. I think the way combat was intended to work, and we never saw this in Battlestar Galactica because we never saw a fleet, right? The only Cylons had a fleet. The humans had a bunch of refugees. The Colonials didn't have a fleet, so they weren't doing fleet tactics. I think that the way that battle stars were designed to operate is they were designed to jump into close proximity with their target, flush their fighters to do stuff, use their big guns because they had big guns, use all their big guns in sort of battleship mode, and then combat land their airplanes, their air wing, and get out of dodge. So I think this was all about being able to jump in, hit hard, do what they needed to do, jump out if there was a big threat coming in their direction. So why do I think that? Well, first of all, they have nice big doors on the flight pods, and you see them come in where they're landing like 3 or 4 coming in at a time, and they're all just sort of throwing their Vipers down on the deck to get them on the deck as fast as possible. So that is that I think is important. You also see they've got their launch tubes pointed out so that even when the Galactica is jumping and her tubes are retracted, her launch bays are up snug against the side of the ship, she can still launch fighters. And she can launch all of her fighters or almost all of her fighters quickly, like all at the same time. She can get her air wing out a lot faster than the Nimitz can get its air wing up in the air. It takes a while to launch a bunch of airplanes, even if you're doing 4 a minute. You know, if you're launching 80 airplanes and you're doing 4 a minute, it takes 20 minutes to get them all in the air. So that's a big deal. Whereas Galactica can get 80 airplanes in the 80 Vipers in the air, then get them out of the tubes, basically at the snapping of your fingers. Okay, so yeah, Wright points out maybe you're using steam to clean the launchers. That makes sense. Okay, let's see. Wright points out the episode with Garth of Izar is For Whom Gods Destroy. And that episode is also notable because one of the guest stars in that episode was Yvonne Craig, so otherwise known as Batgirl. Okay. Yeah, Wright points out that down where he lives, the Board of County Supervisors voted 4-1 to buy the XS United States to sink 20 miles off the coast to make the world's largest reef. And so that's actually pretty cool that they're going to do that. The ship is in horrible shape because she hasn't been maintained. She's just been sitting in, if I remember correctly, Philadelphia, maybe, just getting more and more decrepit over time. So they're going to drag her out to sea and sink her. Melissa asks, could we achieve warp someday like on the Zephyr Cochrane level? Who knows?
That one depends on our physical limitations of our body, really and truly.
I am reminded of something that Lauren Weissman from GDW said, that when people would complain about how the star drive worked in the game 2300, his response was, if I knew how to make a star drive, do you think I'd be working for a game company?
I know, right? It's like, don't get me wrong. I love that the confidence in me.
Yeah.
But I do not grasp quantum physics at that scale. My guys.
I don't either. Scott Voigt points out that some folks at NASA are looking into similar concepts. And so there's the Alcubierre warp drive, which the physicist who came up with it says, yeah, I was watching Star Trek and wondered if you could make that happen. And so he actually basically started with the explanation from Star Trek and tried to see if the math worked. And he concluded the math worked. All you need is negative mass the size of Jupiter. It's been getting
until we get freaking access to using dark matter, that one's not happening.
Yeah,
because that's the only thing I can think of that would give us negative mass.
Melissa, no need to apologize. You are not asking too many questions. Scott says, can't remember. Did they also have capital missiles from the Battlestar? I think we know they had nuclear weapons.
We're talking about Battlestar Galactica right now, right?
Yeah. I think we know that they do have capital missiles. I think we see them, and we know there's a.
What exactly is the definition of a capital missile? So I know the difference.
I think in this case we're talking about a missile that you fire at like a base star, not a defensive missile, but an offensive missile.
Well, we know that they had nukes, so I would imagine that's what you mean by that.
We know that they have nukes, and I believe we see them firing some big stuff. Part of the problem we run into is that Galactica doesn't have shit because she was being in the process.
Yeah, she was in the process of being fully decommissioned and turned into a museum.
She doesn't.
The fact she's even got any capabilities is amazing.
Yeah, she doesn't even have all of her armor.
Yeah,
because, I mean, there's
like she was literally 2 seconds away from being a museum.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
Mathematically, we're close, but I'm not familiar with Battlestar. So I would suggest watching Battlestar Galactica. I will say, if religious allegory is not your thing, Battlestar Galactica might not be for you.
Yeah.
Because it is heavy on the religious allegory. Yeah. It is very heavy on the religious allegory, which someone who grew up in the South who is not religious but can appreciate it because religious trauma. I appreciate Battlestar Galactica, but it is very heavy-handed. It is very heavy-handed with its religious allegory. It is very much look into your Greek mythology for it because it's based around the star signs for the planets. So like Caprica, Gemini, etc., etc.
Yeah, and one of the
like look more towards that for like what you're thinking of for religious allegory.
One of the interesting things about the original Battlestar Galactica was that Glenn Larson was Mormon, and if you're Mormon, there's stuff in there that you see that he borrowed a lot of terminology.
I'm not surprised by that. I actually have not sat down and watched the original Battlestar Galactica. I should at some point, but like it's my understanding it's hard to slog through if it because it did not age well. It's not that it's not a good series, it's just it did not age
well. No, it had problems at the time. I mean, the first couple of episodes were relatively good, and they had a good episode or two at the end. But the problem was they had it in a weird time slot, in part because it was sort of aimed as a kids program when it really shouldn't have been.
Yeah, that didn't that also happen with, it's my understanding, Space 1999?
No, that was something.
No? Okay. Now this is all before my time. So I'm trying to parse through what I know.
The issue with Space 1999 was that the first season was very cerebral, and they decided there needed to be more running, jumping, climbing trees type stuff in the second season. So it went from being this very cerebral show in the first season to fight scenes and all this other stuff in the second season. That having been said, I have a soft spot in my heart for Space 1999, mostly because because of what it could have been, not because of what it was. The same is true.
I only know about the show because apparently that was one of my mom's favorite shows growing up.
Good for her. I love her already. I've never met her already.
So like for 1 year for Christmas, Dad was like, hey, your mom was talking about wanting this DVD set. So what we got her for my Christmas present for her that year was the box set of Space 1999 on DVD. Okay, Melissa, you're a year younger than I am.
So,
because I'm 32.
You mean this box set?
Yes, that exact same one. That exact same box set.
The most inefficient box set ever?
Yes, it is both the most inefficient box set ever, but one of the most visually interesting ones I have come across.
Now, I discovered that my DVD player has a feature, still have this DVD player, I think, has a feature that I didn't realize how important it was, but it turned out to be absolutely critical when watching that. And that was a 1.5 speed. I didn't even, I didn't buy it with the intent of getting a 1.5 speed, but watching those episodes, if you had to spend a full 45 minutes to watch it, I'm not sure that it's worth the effort, but if you only have to spend a half hour, it's fine. And the thing is, unless they're doing like fast music or they're walking someplace fast or they're in a fight scene, 1.5 speed just means that people in the show talk as fast as I do normally.
Oh, so hey, Chris, how's that neurodivergence going for you? Because I said, how's that neurodivergence going for you? Because
it's part of being a debater.
I sit and watch my TikToks at 2 times speed, and it drives this one crazy.
Yeah. So let's see. Scrolling.
I'm old enough to have watched TOS as each episode came out. That's fair.
Scott said something about I actually sailed on her as a young lad. I think that means the SS United States. Scott, I hate to break it to you, but you're old. As one old guy to another old guy, you're old. Okay. I
don't remember what it was the other day, but it was like something that came out in like 2011. And I was like, what? That was how long ago?
Okay, let's see.
What was it that I was looking up, babe? Do you remember?
Logic's Finest says
in 2011.
Galactica had 5 nuclear missiles left on board.
Oh, actually, it might have been like us talking about Battlestar.
Yeah. Okay. Wright mentioned Buck Rogers. It's sort of interesting. The fighter in Buck Rogers was originally a proposal for the fighter for the Viper. And they decided.
I think I remember seeing something about that.
Yeah, I'm glad they went with what they went with, although I like that. My voice is beginning to go, and we're actually at the point where we could stop. I'm going to go through and see if there's anything else I need to comment on here. So Logic's Finest says the original Battlestar Galactica was good. It was very formulaic, not a slog. Yeah, it could have been a lot better than it was and have still maintained sort of the ethos. It was really, in its own ways, it was more like Star Wars. Although with this darker theme, you start off with killing the human race and hey, yeah, we're going to go have adventures.
I mean, to be fair, technically, they did start off with a genocide in Star Wars. It's just you didn't know it for another 30 years.
Yeah, but not in the original Star Wars movie.
You just did not know it yet.
Yeah, Logic's Finest says he watched the original Battlestar Galactica when it came out in 1978. I did too. I was 8th grade, I think, when it came out. So, okay, so let's see. Scott agrees that he is old and he's loving retirement. Good for you, Scott. Good for you.
Fair enough.
All right. I think I don't see anything else that I need to respond to. So, all right. So I'm going to get together with Chris and we're going to figure out when to do this last LCS thing is. And because Chris has done some thinking about this and he's got some cool ideas on it. And then after that, I'm not quite sure. I'll probably do the Mike Bosworth Carriers of Large Objects design studies because that's kind of the low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go ahead and harvest low-hanging fruit because I need to read a bunch of Traveler books. And Martin Doherty writes really long Traveler books. And I'm also hoping, I have no reason to think this, I'm hoping that he's going to be at TravelerCon next week. No reason to think that. Hopefully he'll be there. So we'll see. Logic's Finest says that a Robert April short would be cool. I think somebody's done a Robert April short. I can't remember who it is.
I don't remember who.
Somebody's done one. I seem to recall it was one of those where it was one, if I'm remember, I might be crossing the streams. There was one I remember that was not the highest production values, but there was absolutely nothing wrong with the script, right? And that's as a general rule, if
I think I'm friends with him on Facebook is the thing. Like I've got a face in my head, and for the life of me, I can't remember his fucking name right now.
Yeah. And Wright says Star Trek First Frontier, the fan film, is a Robert April story. And I think that might be the one I'm thinking about.
That might be it.
So some of the Star Trek fan fiction stories are really well written, and some of them are not, and some of them have pretty good special effects, and some of them do not. And there's one, I'll watch one that actually has pretty good effects, that I remember thinking like none of the characters are acting like characters would actually act in that situation. They are not acting like characters in the real world. They're not acting like characters in Star Trek. They're not acting like Starfleet officers. And
yeah,
just really,
the worst part's when it happens within canon Trek stuff.
Oh yeah, that drives me crazy.
It's like, wait a minute. You're telling me that this is how this particular group of Starfleet officers is going to act, and they're not going to get court-martialed because this doesn't go against the Prime Directive.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, that having been said, it probably is worth pointing out that Starfleet officers in the original series do not act the same way that frequently do not act the same way that Starfleet officers do in, say, Next Gen. Like, think about the Galileo 7. Think about all the issues that Spock had with the fact, he's clearly in charge. He's clearly the ranking officer present, and he's constantly having to deal with shit. And none of that made any sense to me. Yeah, and you end up with stuff like that you just, that would, although, I guess Data kind of had the same situation where he was on another ship, and in both cases, Star Trek isn't subtle when they start talking about, that guy isn't like us, so everybody's going to be upset and give him shit. And then,
look, he's an allegory for racism.
Yes.
Well, we have actual racism in there occasionally.
Yes. So.
Yeah, no, Star Trek. Well, that's why, it makes me laugh when I hear people be like, Star Trek's woke now. I'm like, did we watch the same show?
Yeah.
It has always been woke. You're just an idiot.
You just weren't paying attention. Like, what did you think the episode meant when the guy?
What did you want me to? Did you want it to smack you upside the head with it?
Yeah. So.
Oh.
All right. I think that we should probably declare victory because even though the guest didn't show up, we still have done a show that's 75 minutes long. But I'd like to thank Chris Carlson for being the guest this week. And I look forward to the opportunity to thank him for being the guest next time we do it, which won't be next week. I'm hoping we can get Chris the week after. I'll try to confirm that. I'll try to confirm that with him sometime tomorrow. And any last words, Lissa?
Other than you guys can find me on the places with the buttons as Geek Girl. Oh wait, where? Wait.
It's in the
there.
Yeah, and the information is in the description. And I never say this stuff. I should probably start saying this stuff. Like and share it with your friends, and do
the things and the excite and share. And if you like us, there's also subscribe buttons and whatnot.
I've been doing, for what it's worth, I'll give you a little preview. I've been doing some thinking about doing some more original content and stuff like that. I've talked it over with Alec, and I've been thinking about how to go about doing stuff like that. So, but that won't. There's no way that could happen before the new year. I'm just too busy between now and say mid-November, and then the insanity starts of that time period. So I'm sort of aiming for the new year. I hope to have perhaps some additional content. But I do want to comment one last thing real quick on something that Dustin D just said. Captain Edward Jellicoe got Deanna Troi to wear standard uniform on duty. And you know what? Boy, that changed her, didn't it? Right? That
Yeah.
was there. That was just a sort of like, hey, we're going to war, so everybody needs a haircut, right? We're going to war, so everybody needs a haircut. That was that sort of thing. But it really had a big change in her, right? So she sort of went from being the ship's counselor to being a Starfleet officer who happened to be the ship's counselor, right? So she went from being like, Guinan was the bartender and Troi was the counselor to Troi as a Starfleet officer. And and I think that was a fantastic move on their part. And I don't know whether they intended it that way or not.
I 100%. I guarantee. What was his name? God damn it! It was the producer they always had fucking issues with.
Berman?
Because Berman, yes, Rick Berman.
Yes.
I guarantee Rick is the reason why she even started off in that outfit.
Yeah.
100%. I'm telling you, he's the reason why Seven was in the outfit she was.
Yeah, could be.
So,
well, Seven. Yeah, Seven. Well, yeah, the Miracle Borg.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, historically speaking, when he's had his fingers during stuff, and you notice when he got like bapped upside the head and told to step back because of the issues the actresses were having with him, that's when that shift happened.
I did not know that story. All right, time to go look up some stuff.
Yeah, no, he got, like, don't get me wrong, like he has some ebbs and flows for when he like essentially got told off along the way. You can tell when someone in HR came to them with a complaint. Essentially is what happens. Like you can tell based on like the costuming and like how the female characters get written when someone got whacked upside the head.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Melissa says, I can respect Edward Jellicoe. I can too. Edward Jellicoe was the most naval officer-like person I saw in that show.
That's the one that Kelsey Grammer played, right?
No, this is the one that's Ronnie Cox played. This is the one when Picard has been kidnapped by the Cardassians.
Oh, that fucker.
Yeah, no, the thing is, he was fantastic. He was fantastic. He did everything right in that episode. He comes on board and he says, look, this is a bad situation for everybody, but we're about to go to war. And normally coming to a new ship, I'd spend time to sort of learn how you guys do stuff. And then I'd sort of try to ease into the way of doing things my way and blah, 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 blah. We don't have time. So we're going to do the following. We're going to do it now. And he gets everybody, people look at him and go like, what a dick, right? Because he tells Riker that Riker can't spend his time planning a rescue mission. And it's like, what an asshole. It's like, no, he's not.
That's actually what you're supposed to do.
He said to Riker, you've got a full-time job to do. Stop wasting your time planning a mission you're never going to be allowed to execute. It's not going to happen. Stop wasting your time. You've got a job. You should do your job. So he was perfectly right on the money.
Yeah, there are definitely times where he's correct in what he's saying.
Yeah.
But he's also just a dick.
Well, he was decisive and he was operating in a situation where he had to do it the most direct way possible, because as far as he knew, the balloon was going to go up sometime in the next 30 minutes. And they could be at war in the next 30 minutes. And so he just didn't have time to do it. And the thing is, we've all been in this situation at some point or another, right? You know, this is an emergency situation. And in an emergency situation, everybody else should have been saying, the proper response should have been, yes, sir. And so, because, you know, they know what the situation is. And if they don't get it, then they have no business being there. So I have absolutely no problem with Captain Edward Jellicoe, none whatsoever. So, but all right. So let's go ahead and call it. Thank you very much, everybody. As always, I am incredibly honored the fact that you all decide that you're going to spend your Saturday night here with me, or, you know, if you're watching this later, that you've decided that this is worth spending time to watch later. So thank you very much for doing that. We'll have Chris on, we'll finish up the LCS conversation, and then we'll move on to more topics. And I am looking forward to doing more shows, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation with Chris. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, guys. Now we'll see if this button works the way it said.
Changes in StreamYard. We'll see.
Bye, guys.